We have Dr. Mark Iris, and we're going to turn it over to him.
Good evening. Thank you for asking me to speak here. We're going to revisit Leopold and Loeb, arguably the most high-profile criminal case in the 20th century until O.J. Simpson. Noteworthy for us, the cast includes many Jews, and not just the two leads. This all began May 21st, 1924, when 15-year-old Bobby Franks didn't come home from school. The Franks were a wealthy Hyde Park family. Bobby was a student at the private Harvard School. That school and the homes of the Franks, Leopold, and Loeb families were all within a few blocks of one another. When Bobby didn't come home, the parents were understandably concerned. They contacted the family lawyer, Sam Edelson. Dad and Edelson went to the school to look around. While they were out, Mrs. Franks received an anonymous phone call stating the son had been kidnapped. Further instructions would follow. Given that, Franks and Edelson said it was time to contact the police. The next morning, the ransom letter arrived. The original is in the Northwestern University archives. As I held that letter, I was both excited and chilled. When the letter was mailed, 12 cents postage, mailed at 10 p.m., delivered 9:30 the next morning, Bobby Franks was already dead. The cruelty, tormenting the family into thinking they might see their son safe. There you have an image of the envelope and the letter. The same morning, a boy's naked body was found by train tracks near Wolf Lake, by the far southeast corner of Chicago. Significantly, a pair of eyeglasses was found there. We'll come back to that. After that phone call, Attorney Edelson asked the phone company to trace incoming calls. A phone company operator, you all remember those, don't you? Leaked information to the press about the kidnapping. So a media sensation was building, and a reporter told the Franks family of the body's discovery. With that, Frank's uncle went to the morgue. He confirmed that it was, in fact, Bobby Franks. While the uncle was away, Frank's father got a phone call telling him a cab would take him to a drugstore on 63rd Street. There he would get an incoming call on a payphone with further instructions. He was tempted to go, but then got confirmation that his son was dead. Police began a full investigation. This was a high-profile case due to circumstances, plus the family's wealth. Initially, police focused on teachers at the Harvard School. Particular attention was focused on an English teacher, given that the ransom letter was very well written. The teachers all had alibis, good reputations, but police persisted, coerced, beat them in an attempt to get confessions. Eventually, a lawyer got them released. Note that a few years later, 1929, as part of a criminal justice reform effort, President Herbert Hoover appointed the Wickersham Commission. That commission concluded police abuse to coerce confessions was widespread. During the investigation, a boy at the school told police he recalled a gray Winton automobile hanging around the afternoon of the crime. So the police began stopping anyone driving a gray Winton. No suspect Winton was located, so police began thinking of alternate motives besides ransom. They began a dragnet for suspected pedophiles. Remember Claude Rains, round up the usual suspects? On Monday, May 26th, the funeral took place. The service was at home because a media feeding frenzy would have made any other site untenable. While the family had Jewish roots, they were at the time practicing Christian Scientists. Let's pause the investigation, look at the families. The Leopold and Loeb families were very wealthy, members of the Hyde Park German Jewish community. The Leopold family had a large house, full of servants, including a chauffeur. They had 5 cars when many Americans didn't even have one. Think mini Downton Abbey in Hyde Park on Chicago's South Side. Nathan Leopold was the youngest of 3 sons. His mother became chronically ill after he was born. She wasn't much of a presence in his life. A governess was a key figure. Too close. She sexually abused Nathan starting at age 12. He was shy, brilliant, bullied at school. He did well at the Harvard School, exhausted its offerings, enrolled in the University of Chicago at the age of 15. He met Richard Loeb the summer before he started there. Loeb's father was a vice president at Sears, reportedly worth more than $10 million. That's $10 million in 1924 dollars. Add a zero or more to get a sense of what that would be today. At 12, Loeb entered University High School at the University of Chicago. Again, a governess was a key figure in his life, but not for sex, as with Leopold. Dad was busy running Sears. Mom was involved in charitable and social works. He had a governess who felt Loeb was destined for greatness, so she pushed him very hard academically. He graduated high school just days after his 14th birthday. He enrolled at the University of Chicago, way too young, got mediocre grades. The family let the governess go. After all, son's in college, what do we need a governess for? Her departure left a void in his life. Now, there's an ongoing debate about Leopold and Loeb. Some observers felt Loeb was the dominant figure, Leopold more passive, submissive. But others argue that Leopold was more devious, manipulative than previously acknowledged. Whichever one you want to buy into, they clearly both had psychological baggage. At U of Chicago, they were an unlikely pair. Leopold was aloof, misanthropic, Loeb sociable, gregarious. With no governess to give direction and parents distant and uninvolved, Loeb drifted academically. Leopold, more focused, did well. Loeb avidly read crime stories, fueled by a hyperactive imagination, seeing himself as a master criminal. And he was narcissistic, felt the need for an audience. Leopold also had an overactive imagination. His recurring theme, he saw himself as a powerful slave serving a grateful king. Socially, Leopold looked up to Loeb, whom he saw as more worldly and sophisticated. Loeb was a risk-taker, a thrill seeker. Their two separate fantasy lives complemented one another. It's difficult to imagine either one would have done what they did solo. During this time, their lives became more intertwined. Loeb committed a variety of crimes, both minor and more serious. Leopold joined in these to be with Loeb. They committed acts of vandalism, stole cars for joyrides. Okay, 1921, Loeb was bored at home, so he transferred to the University of Michigan. Leopold felt he couldn't be without Loeb, so he also transferred. Leopold had a rough start. His mother died, he got sick. Loeb pledged Zeta Beta Tau fraternity. Any ZBT folks in the audience? But he was told to be accepted, he should not be friends with Leopold. Leopold was perceived as gay. Loeb complied, severed his ties with Leopold for the camaraderie of the frat. Okay, with his mother dead, Loeb out of the picture, Leopold was at loose ends. So he went back to the University of Chicago the next fall. In his second go-round, he really blossomed. He made Phi Beta Kappa, graduated in 23. In 23, Loeb also graduated Michigan at the age of 17, the youngest graduate in the school's history. But he was no scholar. He drank a lot. He was even reprimanded by the frat brothers for excessive drinking. Okay, how much does a frat guy have to drink to be reprimanded by the brothers for heavy drinking? The two reconnected at the University of Chicago when Loeb returned to do graduate work in history, while Leopold started law school. They resumed their relationship, which was sexual, despite Loeb having previously dumped Leopold. Now, Leopold was also heavily into Nietzsche and the notion of a mythical Superman, while Loeb was fantasizing about committing the perfect crime, focusing on kidnapping and ransom. That fall, they drove to Ann Arbor the weekend of a big football game. They broke into the old ZBT frat house, stole some wallets, a typewriter, the same typewriter used for that ransom note. As they drove back to Chicago, the thrill of the crime wore off, a lot of effort for just a few odds and ends. Now, their relationship was becoming more strained. Leopold wanted sex more often than Loeb. Loeb was worried about potential blackmail, as Leopold knew all of their crimes. They reached an agreement. Leopold would commit more crimes with Loeb, and in return, Loeb agreed to more frequent sex with Leopold. On this drive, they also began to plot the perfect crime: kidnap a child, demand ransom, but kill the child anyway to eliminate a witness. Plans evolved in detail: how to secure ransom, how to dispose of the body, evade detection, etc. Now, they would need a car for the crime, and Leopold's car was too distinctive. Thus, they created a false identity: Morton Ballard, a Peoria businessman. The car used in the crime was rented in Ballard's name. On May 20th, they purchased equipment for the kidnapping, including acid to disfigure the body and make identification difficult should the body be found. The ransom letter was typed ahead of time, no name in the salutation, as no victim had been picked. On the day of the crime, they went to the Harvard school in the afternoon to grab a boy. A couple of kids were flagged as possible targets but eliminated. They were playing baseball. No one was alone. Finally, after 2 hours, they were about to give up when they spotted Bobby Franks, who was in fact a cousin of Loeb's. They approached him. Leopold was driving. Loeb got Franks into the car. Once in the car, Loeb struck him with a steel chisel, killing him. The original plan was to strangle the victim with a rope, each one pulling on one end so as to share responsibility. With the body in the car wrapped in a blanket, they drove to Wolf Lake. On the way, they stopped for a snack to wait until dark. Leopold was familiar with Wolf Lake. He was a well-known bird watcher and was often there with birdwatching groups. Given its remoteness, he thought the body might never be discovered. They stripped off the clothes, used the acid to disfigure Franks. They stuffed his body in a drainage pipe. It didn't fit. On the way back, they stopped at a post office to mail the ransom letter you saw. They kept the blanket and clothes to dispose of later. They tossed the chisel out a car window. It was later found by a University of Chicago night watchman. Okay, with Franks dead, it was time to implement the ransom scheme. But then they saw the newspaper headlines reporting the body's discovery. Their ransom plan was elaborate, with a tight timeline keyed to Frank's father taking a specific train at a certain time and tossing the ransom money off the train as it passed a precise spot. The details were meant to ensure the ransom delivery would eliminate any possibility they'd be identified. But the body had not only been found quickly, but identified. The acid had not disfigured Franks. Their perfect conspiracy went down the toilet. They were no longer in control of the narrative. Next day, Loeb was hanging out at the ZBT frat house at U of C. The crime was a prime topic of conversation. News reports said Frank's father had been told to go to a drugstore on 63rd Street to await instructions. But in his agitation, Franks could not recall which one. So Mastermind Loeb suggested to the frat brothers, play amateur detective. Let's go to all the drugstores on 63rd Street and see what they could learn. Leopold was appalled, but Loeb liked flirting with danger. That was part of his fantasy. Leopold also realized he had lost his eyeglasses, but he had an alibi. If the glasses were found near the body, others could confirm he was there on a birdwatching trip just days earlier. As a backup, the two concocted an alibi. Supposedly, they were in Leopold's car, picked up a couple of girls, were hanging out in Lincoln Park. They had only the girls' first names and vague descriptions. To cover their tracks, they dismantled the typewriter, dumped the pieces in Jackson Park Lagoon. They also burned the blanket and Frank's clothes in an open field. Meanwhile, the media feeding frenzy intensified. Print newspapers were the leading news source then. Chicago had multiple daily papers with intense competition for circulation. The headlines were numerous. Cash rewards for solving the crime grew to $16,000. A few days later, the police questioned Leopold, but not as a suspect. They learned of his familiarity with Wolf Lake. With no visible leads, they thought he might know something. Now, those eyeglasses? The prescription was common, but just one optician in Chicago sold that specific frame. The optician began the hand search of thousands of prescriptions and found a pair made for Nathan Leopold. Having linked the eyeglasses to Leopold, police showed up to question Leopold again. This was more to tie up loose ends. He was not yet a suspect. And the state's attorney, called district attorney in some jurisdictions, the state's attorney didn't want to create a media scandal with a prominent family. Thus, Leopold got deferential treatment, was questioned at a hotel, not a police station. Leopold couldn't account for the glasses' whereabouts, just a vague statement they might have fallen from his jacket when he tripped while birdwatching. This got the prosecutor a bit suspicious. That led to a search of Leopold's home, which revealed a gun and a letter to Loeb, not yet sent. The letter made it clear the two were lovers. Prosecutors and police now had a second person, with the two engaged in what was considered a perverted relationship. This intensified their suspicion. Pressure escalated. Questioning shifted from the hotel to the criminal court building. Leopold was asked to demonstrate how those glasses might have slipped from his pocket if he tripped. Leopold tried twice, and the glasses did not fall out. His explanation as to how the glasses were at the crime scene was now very unconvincing. By now, Loeb was also in custody, being questioned separately. The two unidentified girl alibi sounded very weak. Questioning continued throughout the night. Reporters had heard about this, contacted the parents, who said, of course, the boys are innocent. They're simply cooperating with the authorities. They were blind to the reality that their sons were prime suspects, and no one felt the need to have attorneys step in. Miranda warnings, a staple of every Law and Order episode you've ever watched, that came from a 1966 Supreme Court case. The prosecutor had the eyeglasses, Leopold's handwriting on the envelope, Leopold's handwriting matched the handwriting on the envelope. The two suspects were lovers. Enter now another Jew, a ZBT alum and newspaper reporter, Alvin Goldstein. He learned that Leopold had typed notes for his law school study group. He was able to document that those notes were typed using the same make of typewriter used for the ransom letter. Goldstein and another reporter won a Pulitzer Prize for this reporting. While the prosecutor knew the typewriter was in Underwood, none was found at the Leopold home, but a maid said she'd seen one recently. Leopold was evasive about the typewriter and who owned it. So add some more Jews to the cast of characters. Crow brought in the other students in the study group, Schanberg, Adelson, and Mandel. They all denied owning any typewriter. By now, Leopold and Loeb have been in custody for 36 hours, no lawyer. At this point, the Leopold's family chauffeur showed up voluntarily to exonerate young Master Leopold. He said Leopold could not have driven the car used in this crime, as Leopold had asked the chauffeur to fix the car's brakes that day. The alibi nailed it. Leopold and Loeb said they'd been driving around all day in Leopold's car. The chauffeur's statement didn't exonerate them. It showed they were lying. State's Attorney Crow was eager to get this all in place before any lawyer showed up. He confronted Loeb with the lie. Loeb quickly confessed. A stenographer took down the statement in writing at 4:20 a.m. on Saturday, May 31st. Leopold, told that Loeb had confessed, did the same. Each confessed separately. The details were the same except as to who actually killed Bobby Franks. Each one blamed the other. Crow announced that killers were in custody. The parents were stunned. The Hyde Park community was shocked, not just by two of their own as offenders, but from such prominent families. And Crow mentioned other boys at Harvard had been targeted, which of course freaked out many parents. Crow had Leopold and Loeb retrace the crime step by step in a motorcade, from the school to Wolf Lake, back to Hyde Park, etc. The pair showed police where they burned Frank's clothes. A scorched shred of the blanket used to wrap Frank's body was found. And the night watchman who found the discarded chisel turned that over to police. It all fit. And still no lawyer. On the motorcade, reporters asked police if they could interview the two. The police agreed. There were two cars, one suspect and reporters in each of the two cars. In retrospect, this is amazing. You take a field trip with two murder suspects freely engaging with reporters. During this motorcade, Leopold and Loeb blabbed incessantly as to what they had done. Again, each one blamed the other for the killing. Crow quickly got 3 psychiatrists to examine Leopold and Loeb to defeat any insanity defense. They admitted it was for the thrill, putting one over on the authorities. They had no need for the ransom money. Now, the prevailing legal standard was that a defendant is presumed sane. To claim insanity, one must prove the defendant either did not know what he was doing, or if he didn't know it was wrong. The psychiatric exams concluded they both knew what they were doing and knew it was wrong. Crow was in a great position. Confessions, physical evidence, mentally intact, the death penalty for both seemed a certainty. Meanwhile, the light bulb went on, and the families realized their sons were in deep trouble and needed legal help. Loeb's uncle went to Clarence Darrow's home, retained him as defense counsel with just one goal: avoiding the death penalty. Darrow lived in Chicago, was one of the country's most high-profile lawyers. A champion of the working class and underdogs, he viewed the criminal justice system as protecting the upper class. He also viewed the death penalty as barbaric. Darrow was not solely driven by class. He challenged prosecutions where he saw defendants as mentally ill. He felt people shouldn't be accountable for actions driven by psychological factors, even if they met the legal standard for sanity. This case would give Darrow lots of resources and media coverage to convey this to a larger audience. Let's note that in the 1920s, psychiatry and forensic psychiatry were in their infancy. Robert Crow, the Cook County State's attorney, was a Yale law graduate. He was elected on a tough-on-crime platform. He prosecuted high-profile cases. He was a strong believer in personal accountability, and thus was directly at odds with Darrow's position. There was also personal baggage for Crow. In 1923, he prosecuted a high-profile corruption case. By coincidence, Jacob Loeb, Richard's father, was a key witness for the prosecution. Darrow was the defense attorney, and Darrow won the case. Meanwhile, Leopold and Loeb were in Cook County Jail. Legally minors, they were in the juvenile wing. It was a loosey-goosey setup. Instead of jail food, they had meals catered in from restaurants. Crow convened a grand jury. Normally a perfunctory affair simply to present sufficient evidence to justify a trial, Crow had 72 witnesses put their sworn testimony on the record. He feared parents would use their wealth to bribe witnesses to change their stories. The grand jury voted indictments for kidnapping and murder. Public sentiment was clearly for the death penalty. The case was assigned to Judge John Caverly. He set a swift timeline, with the trial to start on August 4th. Recall, the crime took place on May 21st. Darrow used this limited time to bring in noted doctors from across the U.S. to examine the two. Add 2 more Jews to the mix. Darrow's associates, brothers Benjamin and Walter Bachrach. Small world coincidence, they were cousins of Richard Loeb. Another coincidence, Benjamin Bachrach knew Leopold's father. They were both members of the Standard Club, a club founded by Jews at a time when other private clubs banned Jews as members. Experts in forensic psychiatry were not numerous, and Crow had preempted the leading local specialists. So Darrow reached across the country to recruit prominent psychiatrists as expert witnesses. By the way, alienist was used as a synonym for psychiatrist at that time. One doctor was William White, president of the American Psychiatric Association. Dr. White noted Leopold showed no empathy, no regard for others. White said Leopold would kill again. He noted both Leopold and Loeb were detached from reality, and they each had fantasies that fed into the other. Loeb felt quite inferior, compensated for that sense of inferiority through a vivid fantasy life. Other doctors' exams reached similar conclusions. And during these exams, Loeb admitted he was the one who killed Bobby Franks. On the date for preliminary motions, Darrow pulled a surprise. Both defendants pleaded guilty to all charges. Darrow then asked the court, pursuant to Illinois law, to conduct a sentencing hearing. This was his only option. Guilt couldn't really be challenged, and if he tried an insanity defense, Illinois law required that a jury decide that, and no Cook County jury was likely to buy into that. But a guilty plea left sentencing solely in the hands of the judge, no jury. Crow went ballistic. He viewed any assessments of their mental states as irrelevant. Either they're legally sane or not. Nuances as to their overall mental states were not a factor. Darrow's move undercut Crow in another way. Both the murder and kidnapping charges carried a possible death sentence. Crow's plan was to first try both Leopold and Loeb on the murder charge alone. If for some reason he couldn't get a death sentence on that case, there'd be a second trial, separate jury, on the kidnapping charges. He thus had two chances at a death penalty. But with a surprise guilty plea to all charges, there'd be just one trial solely to address penalty, and the decision would be in the hands of one judge, no jury. The trial began. Crow called 80 witnesses to go over details of the crime. Darrow objected as this was all inflammatory and irrelevant. The judge overruled those objections. The defense called the first witness, Dr. White. Benjamin Backrack, Darrow's associate, did the exam given his greater expertise in psychology. Crow immediately objected. The argument as to the admissibility of this testimony lasted 3 days. In the end, Caverly stated he'd allow the defense wide latitude, just as he allowed Crow the opportunity to bring in 80 witnesses to show the heinous nature of the crime. The doctors testified about the governor's pressure on Loeb, leading him to lie about everything. He was emotionally infantile, like a 5-year-old, with an extreme gap between his emotion versus his intellect. Leopold was deemed lonely, living in an inner world where emotions counted for squat, intellect for all. But Crow's cross-examinations significantly indicate these assessments. Another witness noted the sexual relationship between the two, but that testimony was done in a sidebar with judge and lawyers, not heard by reporters or spectators. Why the secrecy? Gay sex was so demonized it could not be mentioned publicly. It was so odious that some states' laws criminalized homosexual activity without even specifying exactly what was forbidden. Those laws forbade what was simply called, quote, the infamous crime against nature. Back at the trial, doctors testified defendants could be both mentally ill yet intellectually capable of planning the crime. This evaded the issue, were they legally insane? This all took place in an atmosphere of high negative publicity. The trial was seen by some as a waste of time and money, an effort to deceive the court. Ku Klux Klan members showed up in court to make their position known. One physician testified that endocrinological and other physical issues, beyond an individual's ability to control, were at the root of their actions. Again, Crow's tough cross-examination scored significant points. The prosecution called its 3 psychiatrists who had interviewed Leopold and Loeb. They stated emphatically they're both quite sane. Throughout that summer, this case was the focus of national media attention. It was not simply a Chicago affair. The heinous crime prompted lots of commentary by public officials, journalists, religious leaders. That 2 youths with all the advantages could be so callous and brutal had great shock value. Sermons and newspaper columns decried spoiled youth, lax moral standards, etc. That the 2 were Jews helped fuel anti-Semitic outrage. Some viewed this as crime caused by Jewish intellect combined with Jewish money used to evade justice. And recall, the Ku Klux Klan was a very powerful domestic force at that time. The Klan was anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic, and anti-Jewish. The Klan made itself known, even held a public cross burning in Hyde Park. In closing arguments, Crow argued that two other young men were recently sentenced to death for a less premeditated crime. They were poor, had none of Leopold and Loeb's advantage. Why should these two be treated more leniently? It was then Darrow's turn to speak. Known as a powerful speaker, 2,000 people tried to get into the courtroom. Darrow argued that Crow sought the death penalty because of the family's wealth. Had they been poor, no one would have taken much notice of this case. He argued the death penalty was almost never imposed if there was a guilty plea. In the past 10 years, 350 people pled guilty to murder in Cook County, and only one was sentenced to death. And in that case, Caverly had been the trial judge at the time. Darrow argued the total lack of motive made clear the defendants were mentally ill. Given Crow's strong cross-examination, Darrow played down the psychiatric testimony. In rebuttal, Crow raised sex assault as a motive. This was a new twist. He asked the coroner's report be read into the record. Again, given the disgust with which homosexuality was viewed, Judge Caverly ordered all women to leave the courtroom. The report was actually inconclusive on this point. Crow also noted Loeb gambled. The ransom may have been needed to pay gambling debts, thus offering a rational motive for the crime. In support of the death penalty, Crow stated if people could not be held accountable through appropriate punishment, anarchy would result. Caverly took the case under advisement. During that time, Frank's family took steps to sell their home. Loeb's family also moved. Leopold, a widower, opted to stay put. He had friends in the area. Leopold's brothers changed their last names to secure some anonymity. Leopold and Loeb got lots of visitors at jail. They were celebrities. Bookies did a brisk business taking bets as to whether they would get the death penalty. The judge was targeted with death threats. There were threats to bomb the courthouse. Lawyers, psychiatrists, everybody was intimidated. Caverly approved live radio broadcast of the sentencing, very unusual at the time. As with the O.J. Simpson case, people stopped to listen. Caverly noted his solo burden in making a life or death decision was heavy, and he would have appreciated help. He suggested legislation be enacted to provide for a 3-judge panel in future cases, as was already being done in some other states. He noted the abnormalities found in the defendants were likely present in other offenders who had not been so closely examined. He said there was no reason for mitigation, and he essentially dismissed the psychiatric testimony. The Leopold and Loeb families braced for the worst, but then Caverly said, and I'll quote, "It would have been the path of least resistance to impose the extreme penalty of the law. In choosing imprisonment instead of death, the court is moved chiefly by the consideration of the age of the defendants, boys of 18 and 19. The court believes that it is within his province to decline to impose the sentence of death on persons not of full age. This determination appears to be in accordance with the progress of criminal law all over the world and with the dictates of enlightened humanity. More than that, it seems to be in accordance with the precedents hitherto observed in this state. The records of Illinois show only 2 cases of minors who were put to death by legal process, to which number this court does not feel inclined to make an addition. Life imprisonment may not at the moment strike the public imagination as forcibly as would death by hanging, but to the offenders, particularly of the type they are, the prolonged suffering of years of confinement may well be the severer form of retribution." He then imposed life sentences for each. Pardon was in theory an option, but the judge urged the parole board to never grant parole. Judge Caverly's decision, grounded largely in the offender's youth, was likely shaped by his prior experience as a juvenile court judge. Cook County was a leader in juvenile justice. It set up the country's first juvenile court in 1899. Jane Addams and other women leaders spearheaded its creation. Leopold and Loeb caught a break because they were minors. Decades later, many states have swung in the other direction. This was driven by a moral panic. Well-publicized brutal crimes committed by young offenders who showed zero remorse fueled fears of a generation of super predators, young sadists running amok who could be controlled only by bypassing juvenile courts and trying them as adults. In reality, as those laws were being enacted, serious juvenile crimes across the country were dropping, as were adult crimes. But these laws enacted in many states now allow juvenile offenders charged with serious crimes to be tried as adults. Reaction to the verdict was mixed. Crow expressed his outrage. Both had the reputation of being immoral degenerates of the worst type. The murder and kidnapping struck terror in the heart of every father and mother throughout the community. It is unfortunate they were not sentenced to death. Outrage over the leniency of the sentence was so intense the two were taken to Joliet prison under heavy escort lest a lynch mob intercept them. In the end, nothing happened. Darrow said he would use this as a catalyst to work for the repeal of the death penalty, but he put that on hold when he took on the Scopes trial the next year. Crow's career deteriorated. Gangster-related murders went up, convictions dropped. A top aide was gunned down as he left a drinking place with a couple of mobsters. Crow lost his re-election bid. Leopold and Loeb were in Joliet prison, which had appalling conditions. When the new modern Stateville prison opened, they were transferred there, but often housed in different wings. They put their intellect to good use. They created a school for inmates offering instruction in various subjects. Leopold did research on predictors of recidivism to help assess who was a good candidate for parole. A paper he authored was actually published by Northwestern's Journal of Criminal Law and Criminology, but given his notoriety, it was published with a pseudonym. Within these prisons, corruption was endemic. Family funds brought favors, but the privileges were erratic, sometimes suspended. Loeb used his charm and his resources to lure inmates to have sex. In 1936, he wanted a new inmate, James Day, as a partner. Day refused. Loeb persisted. Day got a razor and slashed Loeb to death in the shower. Day was tried for murder but acquitted. No inmate would testify. The attacker pleaded self-defense, unlikely given as Day was unscratched, yet Loeb had 56 separate wounds. Loeb's death provoked no public outrage. Frank's murder plus Loeb's homosexuality meant that many saw his murder as a suitable punishment. The death was a profound shock for Leopold. He deeply mourned Loeb's passing, even contemplated suicide. But he also had a privileged position. He served as a clerk in a prison that was woefully understaffed, and for some time had the run of the place. But Loeb's death led to heightened scrutiny. The warden didn't want another high-profile murder on his watch. Loeb wanted to show evidence of rehabilitation, hoping for parole. World War II offered an opportunity. Loeb volunteered for tests of new anti-malaria drugs, crucial for U.S. military efforts in the South Pacific, where many service members were sickened, even killed by the disease. Historical footnote: World War II was the first major conflict in U.S. history where combat fatalities outnumbered disease deaths. Before then, bacteria were more lethal than bullets. But malaria was a serious threat. A soldier ill with malaria was just as unavailable for combat as one wounded in battle. Leopold allowed himself to be deliberately infected with malaria. He suffered from both the disease and the side effects of the new drugs. Medical ethics have changed. We now have institutional review boards to approve any research involving human subjects. No IRB would approve deliberately infecting healthy persons with a deadly disease. After the war, Governor Adlai Stevenson commuted part of Leopold's sentence in recognition of his service. Stevenson felt all inmates should be recognized, even Leopold, despite his notoriety. The reduction was marginal, but that reduction made him eligible for parole sooner. I mentioned earlier Leopold's manipulative nature. He worked in the prison hospital, ostensibly showing his caring nature and documenting his rehabilitation. But that also gave him less confined conditions, which meant greater opportunity to have sex with other inmates. In particular, he worked in the psychiatric wing. with an especially vulnerable group of inmates to victimize. He sought parole in 1953. That was rejected. The parole board found him glib and arrogant. He learned from this, tried again in 59, with lots of character witnesses, including Carl Sandburg. And in the lead up to this, he orchestrated a public relations campaign to make parole more palatable to the public. He was successful. He won release. He returned to Chicago, but was hounded by publicity. He moved to Puerto Rico, went to work at a missionary hospital. He got a master's degree from the University of Puerto Rico, married a widow. When parole supervision ended in 1963, they traveled. He died in 71. There was no funeral. He left his body for science. By the way, members of the Franks, Leopold, and Loeb families are all buried in Rose Hill Cemetery on Chicago's North Side. With that, I'll end the saga of Leopold and Loeb and open it up for questions and comments from you all. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. It's a fascinating story. I mean, there's a lot of twists and you certainly didn't pull any punches in explaining, frankly, what the situations were. Uh, the interesting, I think, to me, one of the most interesting centers of this, of course, is the capital punishment issue, which was the legacy of the trial. Although uh, I would remark that nowadays, when you look at capital punishment laws, the people under 18 years of age are not included in capital punishment in general. So actually, under current laws, where there is capital punishment, they would have been considered as eligible for capital punishment,
Yeah.
correct?
This is, to the best of my knowledge, yes. Illinois abolished capital punishment. First, Governor George Ryan, who was one of four Illinois governors in my time in this state to end up in federal prison, but that's a whole separate story. Uh, Governor George Ryan commuted every death sentence in Illinois. Uh, there had been a wave of wrongful convictions, people on death row who were subsequently exonerated. And of all the arguments against the death penalty, I would say surely the strongest argument, the most powerful one, is um, uh, the possibility of executing someone who is factually innocent of the crime. So Ryan commuted all the death penalties, and then some years later, the Illinois legislature passed a law banning, outlawing, ending capital punishment in Illinois. Um, so, oh, but of course, here in this case, there was no issue of wrongful conviction. It was clear that these two guys were absolutely guilty.
Yes, thank you. I'm going to remove the spotlight. I don't see any questions in the chat. If anyone has questions for Mark um, or comments, uh, if you would like to, since we don't have a lot of questions in the chat, if you would like to say your question out loud, you can unmute yourself. But I would appreciate it if you would hold up your hand if people know how to raise their hand electronically, which I just did. It's a little symbol in the bottom of your screen if you're on the desktop. Otherwise, if you really can't figure that out, just raise your hand.
I see a question here. How accurate was the movie Compulsion? Uh, in legal speak, further affiant saith bupkis. I never saw the movie Compulsion, so I cannot answer that question. Uh,
Okay, any other questions? Okay, I'll throw out another one. I mean, we're all familiar with the movie that was made out of Clarence Darrow's next big trial, right? The Inherit the Wind, right?
uh-huh.
And I mean, really, how was he prominent before this trial, or did this really launch him into a
He was
higher level?
he was very prominent before that. He'd taken on a number of high-profile cases, often on behalf of working class individuals, striking workers, labor unions being coerced by management. There was a high profile case arising from the Pullman factory, which was in Chicago. There was another case that got gathered national publicity. I think it involved miners in Colorado. So, in this pre-TV internet media era, he was a nationally high profile attorney, and he happened to be living in Chicago. This um, so I think his fame is why the Leopold and Loeb family sought him out. They didn't seek him out and then lead to his becoming famous.
I mean, was it clear from the beginning? Did we understand his motive for taking the case? Was it money, or was it was it that he
I
saw?
think I think well, number one, he was ardently opposed to the death penalty, and here
Mhm.
was a slam dunk death penalty case. So I'm guessing he saw this as both an opportunity to spread his word, to share his opinion in a high profile case. It gave him an opportunity to preach to a national audience because the case was getting national coverage about the evils of the death penalty as he saw them.
Well, thank you. Do we have any other questions? Please, you have a
You
great
got 7 minutes.
opportunity
Don't be reluctant.
to have an expert here on this issue, and somebody also really, really familiar with Chicago policing in general, right? Um, I remember my first introduction to Chicago policing was in the book Boss, right? You're familiar with that?
I am very familiar with that. Mike Royko, and in fact, there was a major scandal in 1959 when it turned out that a group of burglars were working hand in hand with Chicago police officers. Um, the officers would stand watch, would stand guard while the burglars cleared out people's homes in broad daylight while they were away at work. And to make a long story short, that whole scandal led to the creation of the police board, the office where I served as executive director for 21 years. And it also, again, making a long story short, under new leadership, Chicago police were cutting edge professional reform policing in the US in 1960s. That obviously changed as time went on, but there were a whole host of reforms all for the better, which were initiated during that era as a direct result of that scandal. It's called the Summerdale scandal, if any of you want to look it up on Wikipedia.
Well, and then you also had the notoriety of the Chicago police. I'm old enough to remember the '68 convention as well, right?
Yes, I was not in Chicago at that time. I came to Chicago in 1969 as an immigrant from Brooklyn.
Oh, okay.
I'll throw in one more thing, if I may. If any of you get an epiphany at 3 in the morning and have a question, feel free to contact me by email. The email address is my name, Mark Iris, Markiris, at northwestern.edu.
We have another question, Mark. Um,
I wanted to ask, do you feel like there were so many Jewish players in this story? Do you feel like that this was more uniquely Jewish than other cases like this were in Chicago at the time? Or is there a reason why there were so many Jews involved?
Uh, it's not just that you had Jews involved, but it was almost incestuous. I mean, Benjamin Backrack knew Leopold's father from the Standard Club. Bobby Franks was a cousin of Richard Loeb, et cetera. It's um, it was a unique case not only because of the heavy Jewish involvement, but also you had not one, but two very prominent wealthy families involved. And you had a kidnapping for ransom and a murder. And while kidnapping for ransom may be high up on the list of every parent's nightmare about their kids, in reality, it is a very rare crime. To the extent we see child kidnappings, it's typically a parental custody dispute where the non-custodial parent grabs the kid from the custodial parent after a divorce. So it's a shocking crime. Very prominent families. They happen to be Jewish. Hyde Park, that area, was a very wealthy enclave at that time. And of course, even to this day, a crime with a rich, powerful, or famous victim attracts a lot more media attention than an inner city homicide. Think of the crimes that have captured our media attention. O.J. Simpson, John Benet Ramsey. These are the atypical crimes, and this crime had several of the traits that would lead to its being a high-profile media frenzy. It was not a typical crime for Chicago in the 1920s.
I guess years ago, I remember hearing our former mayor, the second Daley, saying there's no such thing as a coincidence. And there are just so many coincidences in here, and so much incensed behavior, as you said. I mean, the only thing that insider trading that there may have been is that, they didn't get the death penalty, but it's always bothered me about the cases. Why was it so Jewish?
Um, I think it is just a weird coincidence. You had, two very bright Jewish boy chicks with a lot of pressure, and they went off the deep end. It was just, it's a one-off. I don't think we've seen anything like this in the last 100 years. If it happened again, if we had a similar case, then we say, oh, very strange coincidence. Not that I'm an expert on the history of U.S. crime, but from my perspective, this was really a very unique case in a number of different ways.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mark. I had one more question. Were the two from George Alexander, were the two expelled from their fraternity?
Well, Leopold was never a member of a fraternity. He was too misanthropic and isolated. Whether ZBT formally expelled him, I'm not familiar with fraternity culture. Once you graduate, are you still officially a member subject to expulsion? If anybody knows, please tell me. I just don't know. I mean, he had graduated Michigan the year before, remember?
Uh-huh.
So he may have been a ZBT alum, but was he officially still a ZBT member? I don't know how Greek frat culture works in that respect.
Uh-huh. Okay. Thank you. Well, we're at the hour or a little bit past, and we try to respect everyone's time. Thank you very much, Mark. This was very fascinating.
Thank you.
Our next webinar on a tasty subject, but in a more positive way, will be on June 25th on corned beef and camaraderie, the history of the Jewish deli in Chicago. So we'll have Dr. Ted Merwin, who's a senior writer for the Federations of North America, talking about his book, Pastrami on Rye, an overstuffed history of the Jewish deli, with a focus on Chicago deli history in this next seminar or webinar. So thank you very much, and I hope we see you in the future at these. And thank you, Mark.